Welcome to the Texas Conflict Coach radio program. If you've ever experienced or engaged in destructive or unresolved conflict, then you know it leads to broken relationships, distrust, and damaging results. Our program will help you manage and resolve conflict effectively with strategies, valuable resources, and support. Since 2009, our radio program hosted guest experts from around the globe sharing their perspectives, experiences, and expertise while giving you food for thought. If you can't listen live, then download and listen to any of our 300-plus podcasts in our library at texasconflictcoach.com. So sit back, relax, or join the conversation every Tuesday evening, or tweet us at TXConflictCoach.
Most of us understand when there is a conflict, but we have not looked at what keeps us locked there. Our program, Conflict's Powerful Magnets, Identity, Emotions, and Power, will examine how these magnets work in conflict and how understanding each of them can reduce their pull on us and show us paths out of the situation. Now, joining me are returning guests Tricia Jones and Zina Zemeta. Now, Zina, who has been a guest host for us for a number of years, is coming on as a guest expert with Tricia Jones. She's internationally known as both a mediator and trainer of mediators. She is president of the Mediation Training and Consultation Institute, the Zina Zemeta Mediation Services, and the Collaborative Workplace in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Zina is a lawyer and a former president of the Academy of Family Mediators. She is also the recipient of numerous awards, including the Michigan Lifetime Achievement in Mediation Award, the National Education Association Saturn Corporation Award for Union Management Collaboration, the John Haynes Distinguished Mediator Award, and the Kumba Award from the National Conference on Minorities and ADR. I was learning about that, Zina, and I had no idea. It's wonderful. That's wonderful recognition in your field. And, of course, we also have our renowned and returning guest expert, Tricia Jones, and she is a professor of education at Temple University in Philadelphia, and she is the project director of the CRETE Project, which stands for Conflict Resolution Education in Teacher Education. CRETE has been funded since 2004 by the United States Department of Education and the JAMS Foundation. Dr. Jones has worked with thousands of teachers, helping them understand how to teach students constructive conflict management to help create safe and effective schools and communities. She is a member of the Peace Education Working Group of the Global Partnership for the Prevention for Armed Conflict, working around the world to support conflict education and peace education. Welcome back, Tricia and Zina, to our program.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so conflict is our game, and this is what we love doing and helping others understand. And today we're going to talk about these powerful magnets, identity, emotions, and power. And as you said, we often we say amongst ourselves we often get stuck there. We're locked into these conflicts and sometimes for years. So, Tricia, why don't you talk more about these powerful magnets? What are they, if you could help us by just kind of defining them?
Well, thanks, Patty. And one of the things I love about what you're helping us understand is that this idea of magnets is that these three things each pull us, but they also pull on each other in conflicts. And so when we're talking about identity, we're really talking about whether or not you're being seen in a certain way. Your role, maybe in terms of your role as a parent or your role as an educator or your role in the workplace, or how you want to be respected as. If I'm not being respected in a certain way, then my identity is being hurt or damaged somehow. And the emotion is really how you're feeling, literally that kind of gut-level emotional experience that we have that has so much to do with how we respond to people and how we're responding to a situation. And when I talk about power, I think that a lot of people think about power in terms of do you have control over somebody else, but I think of it more in terms of influence. What can you make happen? So do you have the ability to make certain things happen or make certain changes happen? And those three things really, they always work together. If your identity is hurt, you're not going to feel very good about situations, and you often feel like you cannot have the influence that you'd like to have. So these three are really kind of the underpinning of most of what keeps us in a conflict that's not going well.
So it looks like it could work together well, but it could also pull us apart as well, these same magnets.
Definitely. And if one of those things is troubling you, I mean, for example, if you really feel disrespected in a way that's very important to you, if you're a mother and you're really feeling disrespected because of the conflict that you're dealing with in terms of a divorce or a family situation or not being able to stand up for your child in school, unless that identity is dealt with and you feel good about how you're being seen and treated, you're probably not going to be able to get past the emotional magnets that are pulling you into certain behaviors or that powerlessness sense that pulls you as well. So these three definitely pull and work together.
Okay, very, very good. Well, we're going to break this down and go a little bit further. So, Zena, why, tapping into what Tricia just mentioned about identity, emotion, and power, let's talk about identity first. Why is this one so important?
It's funny. I think all of us are focusing, when I hear the terms identity, emotion, and power, I notice that people are attracted to one or another first. And for me, it's definitely identity. That one just resonates with me as a real issue in conflict, something that I see all the time. And I do believe that in a lot of the conflicts that I see, that I've been involved in, that the identity part of it is a key to why people just can't resolve. So, for example, I mean, you can easily see identity issues in the workplace where there are two people who are having a conflict, and one of them feels like their whole role is disrespected, like they can't quite get out of the fact that they should be more important in a particular role. And I've certainly seen that with supervisors and employees where the supervisor is feeling like, wait a minute, my identity as a supervisor is not being respected. The employee can also feel at the same time that their work product and their role in whatever it is not being respected. And that may be the core of the conflict. But I also see it in divorce mediation, that in a divorce, people are losing their roles. It's the role of husband or wife. It's the role sometimes of parent. And when you see those big custody disputes, a lot of times I really feel that the issue there is my identity as a parent is being threatened. So, Trish, I'm wondering if you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, I mean, and everything you said is so important and valuable. I also think a lot of times people have, it's not just whether somebody else is respecting or not respecting who we want to be. It's that we really have more than one identity, and they're not necessarily walking hand in hand together, so that I may have an identity as a mother and as a teacher and as a researcher, and it's because I'm pulled in different ways about the ways I have to relate to myself that can cause conflict and trigger conflict. And the other part that I think is really important about identity is a lot of times we assume we know who the other person in the conflict wants to be, what their identity is, but we don't check it out, and so we maybe with the best intentions blunder forward, and we do things that hurt them. They literally hurt the way they feel they're being respected. And so I think this is a good kind of a wake-up for us to always think about that it's not a simple situation. We've got to deal with our identities and how they're in line or not in line. And then we've got to take a second and a third look at the other people that we're in conflict with. It's a tough question.
One thing that comes for me as I'm listening to the two of you define identity in these examples, and go back to something you first said, Tricia, which is being seen in a certain way, and certainly in our different various roles and hats that we wear. But I also see where people say, well, I want to be seen as being credible and intelligent and professional, and yet the way they show up and are seen by others might be completely opposite. So it's this role, but also, as you said, being seen in a certain way, and they're not being seen in that certain way, and that certainly threatens that self-identity that they have of themselves. I didn't know if you had any comments about that.
Oh, again, such a great insight. I think that's one of the things that coaches can do so well with folks is to basically show them whether there's a disconnect between how they're behaving and the messages they're sending off when they're working with or being with other people, and the kind of messages they'd like to send in order to be the person they want to be in that situation. So, because some folks just, they don't track that very well, and they need some other set of eyes to be able to give them that feedback. And coaches are perfect to be able to do that.
Well, and all of us are
also.
Go ahead, Zena.
Oh, I'm sorry. And also just to identify what identity they want. I mean, I think coaches are really good at that too, to really figure out, how do I want to be seen?
Absolutely. So now let's say that they're struggling then with this role identity, how they're being seen in a certain way, especially in conflict. So Tricia, how can we deal with our emotions in conflict? Like you said, they all tie together as powerful magnets.
Yeah, I think the number one thing, that I've learned in my experience is that sometimes, emotions are so overwhelming for folks. It feels like a flood coming over them. And they need to be able to kind of pull back and figure out, okay, what are the feelings I'm having? Step back and, try to basically say, well, is it that I'm feeling angry or upset, or is it that I'm actually feeling a little bit of sadness as well? Is it that I'm feeling, frustrated or fearful or scared? A lot of what we know about in terms of what folks discuss as kind of emotional competence or emotional intelligence, the very first thing that folks need to build as a skill is the ability to know their own feelings and then try to understand the feelings of other people. So the other thing is it's not easy to do that because a lot of people are not very comfortable with feelings and emotions and often have kind of gotten the message as they've grown up or in their workplace that you're supposed to be able to kind of be, Mr. Spock, set feelings aside, put those guys in a box, someplace. So there's that. We have to get in touch with what's going on, have to feel okay about saying that, there might be more than one kind of feeling that I need to get in touch with. And, feel like, we can give ourselves the room to do that. That's not always easy, but it's really helpful.
And anything else that you would want to add, Zena, to this?
Well, I would agree with Trish that a lot of people are so uncomfortable with their emotions. And one of the things that I've noticed is, and I don't mean to stereotype, but men in particular, when they begin to get overwhelmed by their emotions, then they have to add on to it something to cover it up. And so I see a lot of people who come in angry because they don't want to show all those other emotions that are underneath that. And I think for us to understand that anger is often the cover, and that we really need to go below and see what's underneath it. And certainly in a coaching situation, when we're talking to someone to help them try to get beneath that anger to see what's there. And sometimes when you can do that, when it's tears and people can actually begin to let their emotions out, things do calm down.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so being able to give themselves permission to be able to do that. But I love what you said about, kind of anger is like this blanket, right? And it's smothering all these things that are really deeper that's motivating those emotions and really being able to be clear, help them be clear, help themselves be clear about what that is. And I like what you said, Tricia, in the sense of pulling back. We get overwhelmed, and so these magnets are so powerful, when we're in conflict and can go awry very quickly. So let me let people know that they're tuned in and listening to the Texas Conflict Coach Blog Talk Radio program. And we're talking with Zena Zametta and Tricia Jones about conflict's powerful magnets, which are identity, emotion, and power. And we've just talked about some examples around identity and why it's so important and how our emotions can get overwhelming and pull us apart, actually. And what we're saying is let's pull back. Let's recognize what is going on here. We don't have to be Mr. Spock. So let's talk about then, what if the other, let's just clarify actually the power piece. First of all, Tricia, you mentioned influence. What can you, as the person in conflict, make happen? And oftentimes when we're in conflict and we're overwhelmed with the emotions, you said we start to feel powerlessness. And so Zena and or Tricia, what I want you to clarify first is when you're talking about power and influence, I want to make sure listeners hear that you're not talking about manipulation.
Well, I wouldn't leave it out, but
so let's talk about that then. I want to make sure they're like, oh, I'm going to be a real manipulator here, right?
I think manipulation is one kind of power, but no, I think we're talking about all different kinds of power. And, power to me is utterly fascinating because as a mediator, I watch power go back and forth or stay in one particular place, but I also watch people's perceptions of their own power. So, for example, I have seen people who look as though they're very mousy, but then when you look at what's happening, you realize they just got their way in everything. And how did they do that? What was it? And do they feel like they have the power? And there are other people who are roaring like lions, and you feel like, oh, they must be really powerful. But what's going on is their internal feeling is, I'm powerless. And so I have to have all that much more aggressiveness to really compensate for my feeling of complete powerlessness. So I don't think it's just the issue of who actually has influence, but also do they perceive that they have influence. And so both of those really act in conflict to escalate conflict often when people don't realize that they actually do have influence. So, Trish, I'd love for you to jump in.
Oh, that's, when you were talking, Zena, about kind of the person who really feels insecure, but they put on this big show, like a roaring lion. The immediate image that came to my mind is one of those lizards that puffs up its neck real big, and kind of gets up on its hind legs and runs across the desert, It's like, and it's so true because folks go, especially people who feel like they're insecure anyway, they have this whole kind of thing that they often trip over into very quickly and don't understand that can be as off-putting, and can make it that much harder to get any kind of an influence in a situation. It's also one of the things that I see a lot is that, people don't feel powerful because they don't have goals that they've thought through, and that there's a real link between those two things. I mean, if, I know really what I want, that in and of itself is a powerful kind of thing because then I have a direction. I have some place that I can go. I think sometimes when people are unclear about what they really want to do, it kind of deepens that sense of vibration that feeds into a conflict. And that often, really ties in a lot with the identity things we were just talking about. I am about ready to become an empty nester, okay? And one of my, really important roles is the role of mother. And my son's getting ready to head off to college. And I've been thinking a lot lately about kind of this little insecurity I'm feeling about, oh, my heaven's sakes, if I don't get to be mom in the way that I've been for the last 17 years, wow, what takes that place kind of thing. And I think a lot of people who are going through conflict where there's a real identity or a role change are even more prone to have the kinds of reactions that you've been talking about, Zena. And that's an important insight.
Yeah, so I think that helping people to look at what power do they have, and I think you're so right that understanding the goal or understanding the loss of role can really help people to bring the power into a unidirectional manner instead of an omnidirectional power play. And I think for most people, it's when people are pushing out that energy in every direction, other people get frightened. But when it's focused, then people actually can deal with it and can work with it in conflict. So I think that helping to focus both the influence and the goal really makes a huge difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, helping somebody feel powerful in a small way can actually ramp them up to becoming very powerful in a positive sense relatively quickly. It's like moving the car, out of the, rut. If you're stuck in snow and you get just enough traction, then you're gone, Then you're gone. You've made it.
Well, I love what you're saying.
Metaphor for today.
Yeah. I love all the metaphors we're using. That's very helpful, especially in a audio, radio program. And so let me ask this question then. What if the other person has all the power? And a lot of times we assume, well, that's my boss. He's got all the power. That's the spouse that seems to, and I'm not talking about extreme situations like domestic violence where there's an extreme balance or workplace bullying. Those get to the extreme ends there. But what if the other person is perceived to have all the power? You already talked about focus and direction. And what if they're clear but they don't feel like they have a voice? What would you say about that?
One of the things that I've really focused on for a long time is helping people to understand that everyone has power and to really figure out what is the power of each of the people in the room. And, Patty, you mentioned that an employee may feel that their supervisor or the boss has all the power, but I've noticed in mediations, and I'm sure you have as well, that I often feel very sorry for the supervisor because he really does. And when they get into the conflict and the mediations, someone who feels like they have no power often has nothing to lose. And so they will just blast everything out. And then the supervisors get really scared. I mean, they do worry at that point about workplace violence. And so helping a person who feels like they have no power is really important so that they can see where their power exists, where their influence exists, and how often they've been holding up a lot of issues in the workplace or at home or with friends, and to really focus on the power that they do have.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And Tricia, I don't know if you want to add or...
Oh, yeah. And I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, Zena, the folks who they actually, because they don't feel like they can do something or make something happen, and they don't try or haven't tried for quite some time, that they also turn that on to the other person as though that's the other person's intention.
Yes.
To put them or keep them in kind of a powerless situation. And some that might be true, but oftentimes it's not true. Oftentimes, talking with somebody about whether that might be happening helps them come to understand that they've actually been blaming somebody else by thinking that this other person has all the power and is using it against them, when in reality, the other person is just as uncomfortable in what this kind of power relationship is and would love to find a way out. I also am a big believer in, and I agree with you, there's always power to be had. And even if it's just, you have the power of your own response to something. I was watching a show not too long ago on the BBC, this wonderful dialogue that was happening between a number of peace activists in the question of response and violence and nonviolence. And one young woman, I wish I could remember her name, but she stood up and she started her presentation by saying, there's a difference between giving offense and taking offense. Both are intentional acts that we often don't think that taking offense is an intentional act. But I would argue to you that everyone always has a choice, whether to choose to be offended and then respond in that kind. And I think that's wisdom. I think people have the choice to make about whether they will agree to feel disempowered or put in a powerless position. And, even if that's the only quote-unquote change you can help somebody make, that is a powerful one.
I'm so glad that you talked about that choice in addition to that having focus and direction, but they have a choice about their voice and a choice about their response. So as we start to wind down, we've talked a lot about these magnets and how they can pull us apart, but how do they pull us out of the path of conflict?
Great question. Well, Zena said earlier that everybody responds somewhat differently, in terms of some folks go immediately to thinking in terms of identity or emotion or power in terms of how they're trying to understand their own conflict situation. And I think that, they build stepping stones that we can use to move out and beyond the current conflict that we're in. So clarity in any one of these areas, if you resonate with identity, and if you can sit down and have some internal reflection or talk with a coach or a mediator about what's really important to you in terms of your role or how you want to be seen, and anything that you can be doing to try to reinforce or make that happen, or to understand the way that you can protect that if you need to in a constructive way, then that will help you often to feel a lot better in terms of your emotional experience of the conflict, and make you feel that you've got different choices and different possibilities for influence. So, these are, kind of like literally, if you can get a little bit of step up on one, you'll find that the other two will kind of come up to meet you in the sense of moving you then kind of forward out of the conflict. And I think following people's wisdom, as Zena suggested earlier, is really important. Where do they go first? And let's see if we can help them get a handhold or a foothold there for that first step out of the destructive conflict.
And, I often think of them as lifelines, that somebody who is so overwhelmed with conflict, and then you can begin to ask them about identity, or about what emotions are there, or feelings of powerless, and all of a sudden you'll see people come back to life and start to analyze and begin to realize, and then that helps them to take power and to use their influence.
Very good. So, and that ties back to that, getting that clarity of direction, because that clarity comes down to looking at those three powerful magnets. All right, so we're getting ready to give our listeners an assignment for the week or a call to action, but before we do that, is there anything missing that you wanted me to ask you about this conversation that you want to address now?
Well, I wouldn't say it's missing, because I think we've talked about it a little bit, but the one thing I would put out there is that the more we can help somebody in conflict, try to take the perspective of the other person in conflict in terms of what's happening for them in terms of identity and emotion and power. I think the more we have that connection, that, overall helps the conflict become more constructive. So all of these great insights that would help the party who is experiencing the conflict, if they can then just really reach out and say, let me turn this around and really try to understand the other person in the same ways I've just helped myself understand what's happening for me. To me, that is peacemaking in action, and it's peacemaking in spirit. So.
Okay, fabulous. And Zena, were you going to add anything as well?
No, I think that really is the only piece that I was thinking might have been missing is to look at the other person as well. And then, of course, if you're in a dialogue, if you're able to be in a dialogue, to be able to ask the other person about those things.
Okay, fabulous. So not only looking at those powerful magnets from our perspective and gaining insight and awareness for ourselves, but really the missing part is we need to do that for the other person and really try to step into their shoes as regards to identity, emotion, and power. So Zena, what assignment do we have for our listeners this week so they can take that next step?
Well, I would suggest that each listener really thinks through which of those resonates with them. Is it identity? Is it emotion? Is it power? And then whichever one they pick, to start to list items. So list all your identities, or list which emotions have really caught you in a particular conflict, or what power do you have and the other person have as well. And just pick one, list them, and it's just a great place to start.
Okay, fabulous. Thank you. So listeners, you have your assignment to take the next step. And of course, these podcasts are recorded and downloadable, so you'll be able to listen to this again over and over as many times as you want. And we'll give you some guidance definitely in what you're wanting to do. So Zena and Tricia, it doesn't matter who starts first, but what final message do you want to leave with listeners?
Well, I always think understanding is power. So the more that you can understand about yourself, the more that you can understand about the other person, it really does begin to give you the path out of that conflict.
Okay, great.
And
thank you.
I again completely agree with what Zena is talking about. I also would say that for folks who are really feeling confused and lost in a conflict, if you open any one of these 3 doors, if you can make any kind of connection with what you're thinking about and understanding in terms of identity, or you go through the door of emotion, or you go through the door of power, any one of those 3 doors you open will open the other 2. So don't give up. Stick with it. Find a place to start that helps you and that you're comfortable with, and then that is going to help you get an understanding and hence more power in all of the areas. And frankly, make the magnets work for you rather than against you.
Wonderful. Okay, so very, very good final messages. And listeners, if you want to reach out to Tricia Jones, you can find her at www.conflictcoachingmatters.com, and this is also on the program page. It's all one word, no hyphens, slashes. And also, if you want to find Zena, you can find her at www.learntomediate.com, and learn to is a number 2, learntomediate.com. Again, conflictcoachingmatters.com and learntomediate.com. Zena and Tricia, thank you so much for joining us back on our program. This has been extremely valuable information to help people understand not only these powerful magnets, but how they can use these magnets to pull them out of these conflict situations. So thank you again for being with us.
Well, thank you.
Thank you,
it's been fun.
Thank you for listening to the Texas Conflict Coach. We hope you've enjoyed the program. You can find over 300 podcasts archived to listen at your own convenience at texasconflictcoach.com, or download the podcast at iTunes or Stitcher Radio. To learn about upcoming radio programs and resources, sign up for our monthly e-newsletter.